I want to elaborate on the Mishnah Berurah's comments about davening in another language. And he's referring to the fact that this is one of the things that the Reform movement started with, to daven in German. And of course it was a terrible mistake, as the Mishnah Berurah says, and we see what it led to. So I want to explain as follows. Put it in context. We have a Masorah of both Torah Shebechsav and Torah Sheba'al Peh, dating back to Har Sinai. The Masorah consists of the aggregate of halachos, values, attitudes, and patterns of behavior and thought that comprise our tradition. However, a definition of Masorah that stops there would be sorely lacking. A crucial element of Masorah is the role of the Chachmei HaMasorah. The Chachmei HaMasorah are not simply reliable recorders and transmitters of the Masorah. Rather, they are an integral part of what the Masorah is. They interpret and apply the Masorah for us, and by doing so, they enrich and protect the Masorah. It is impossible to discuss Masorah without emphasizing the importance of and the obligation to listen to the Chachmei HaMasorah, who teach us how to properly learn the Torah Sheba'al Peh, as well as how to paskin based on it. When that element of the Masorah is neglected, the consequences are tragic. We must look to the Balei HaMasorah for guidance as to what the halacha is, what proper Torah attitudes are, Rav Shechter always emphasizes that, and how we should approach the new issues that arise in every generation. Rav Shechter often notes that today, when we no longer have Nevuah, it is especially important that we follow the guidance of the Talmidei Chacham of the generation. He often mentions that two of the early changes made by the Reform movement were playing an organ during davening. Originally a non-Jew was appointed for this role, and davening in German instead of Hebrew. On technical halachic grounds, both of these changes could have been defended. Although we don't hold this way halacha l'maisa, some Achronim say that having a non-Jew play music on Shabbos at a simcha is a shvus to shvus b'makom mitzvah. And the halacha is that one is allowed to daven in a language other than Hebrew, if he understands that language. Nevertheless, all of the leading Talmidei Chachamim of the generation came out against these reforms for a variety of broader halachic and Masorah-based reasons. The reform leaders of the time ignored the Talmidei Chachamim, and today we see the tragic results. This is an important lesson for us nowadays. Even if something is, or seems to be, technically mutter, if the leading Rabbanim don't support it, we must stay away. Similarly, JTS was founded in the early 1900s by well-meaning, but very deeply misguided Orthodox rabbis. They thought that the new approach to halacha would be able to conserve halachic Judaism and prevent the domination of assimilation and reform. Of course, we see the results a century later. It's clear they were tragically mistaken. These well-meaning Orthodox rabbis didn't ask the guidance of the great Torah leaders. The mistake began with their rejection of the absolute authority of Chazal's Torah Sheba'al Peh. All of the great Torah leaders at the time rejected the new movement. And ultimately, the conservative movement rejected explicit psukim in the Torah, such as the prohibition against a kohen marrying a divorcee and many other psukim. In our own day, there are well-meaning, deeply misguided Orthodox rabbis who try to develop new ideas and new approaches as well. We must be very careful in evaluating them. Rav Shechter of Wilk Shlita often note the difference between Chiddush and Shinui. And who can decide? Only the great Torah leaders can decide whether a new idea is a positive Chiddush or a tragic Shinui. Rav Shechter always quotes this difference of Chiddush and Shinui is found in Halachic Man by Rav Soloveitchik, note 98. Any action or movement that goes against the views of our great Torah leaders falls outside of our Masorah. For this reason, whenever a new movement starts, or whenever the question of adjusting accepted practices is raised, the only correct approach is to go to the Gedolim for advice and counsel and approval. For example, 100 years ago, it was uncommon for young women to study Torah on an advanced level. The Beis Yaakov movement was a revolution. Sover Shner, the founder of Beis Yaakov, received the blessing of the Ger Rebbe and other Gedolim, and that is why her revolution succeeded. This is the way it's always been. Any new idea has to pass the test of the Gedolim. And without that, you end up becoming conservative, which is exactly what's happening now. Open Orthodoxy started around 20 years ago. The Gedolim all came out against it. They ignored the leading Gedolim, and now it has turned into a new conservative movement with dozens and dozens of examples. There's an important book called Why Open Orthodoxy is Not Orthodox. And there are many, many articles available online about this. And this is a big problem. So this idea of davening in German, which technically could have been defended, but the Rabbanim saw this as part of a break from the Masorah, and they saw what it would lead to, and of course they were, tragically, exactly right. We have to be so careful. We should take this halacha and learn from it. Now the truth is, very often, things that people say are mutter are really aser. You have to know the whole Shulchan Aruch. But even if something might be technically mutter, it doesn't matter. If all of the Gedolim reject it, it's outside the Masorah. Now, it's very important to mention something. People like to say, well, Sarah Schneer didn't really get a haskama before she opened Beis Yaakov. There's a famous letter from the Chafetz Chaim, but that letter came out after Beis Yaakov was already in existence for a while. And they say, oh, we see, it's not true. It was a grassroots movement, and later the Gedolim agreed. And people want to extrapolate from that to what's happening nowadays. This is unfortunately a terrible historical inaccuracy, and it's used to promote this new conservative movement. Now, it's true that Sarah Schneer did not receive formal support from the Ger Rebbe and the Chafetz Chaim until a few years after she began her school in Krakow. The facts are, however, that she sought out and received the blessing of the Belzer Rebbe before opening her first program. And there is no substantive difference between receiving the bracha of one Gadol or three Gedolim. Shortly thereafter, Agudas Yisrael began supporting her program, which means many Rabbanim supported her. A few years later, the Ger Rebbe and the Chafetz Chaim. Clearly, had all of these three Gedolim opposed the idea, she wouldn't have gone forward. So the Beis Yaakov movement is the perfect example of the need to follow the guidance of the Gedolim when starting something new. It was not a grassroots movement, but rather a Gadol-approved movement. And nowadays, in contrast, the neoconservative movements, the new one, Open Orthodoxy, breaches, have been explicitly and forcefully rejected by all of the leading Gedolim. This is all well known. The same people that talk about that the Ger Rebbe and the Chafetz Chaim came in a few years later, they know that the Belzer Rebbe was there in the beginning. And yet, this historical inaccuracy, which paints the Beis Yaakov movement in a different light, is promoted. We have to understand, we have to stick with what the Chassam Sofer wrote, and what the Chafetz Chaim says, and what all the Gedolim say. You've got to follow the leading Gedolim, and something new comes up, you have to be extra careful, and it's happening right now before our eyes. So many things. The Rabbanim said one thing will lead to another, and that's exactly what's happened. The most recent thing is women rabbis, which was the symbol of conservative Judaism for 30 or 40 years. So what's called Open Orthodoxy, which is actually correctly titled neoconservatism, is a perfect example of the tragic consequences when you don't follow the Gedolim, and it's exactly the same idea that's expressed here in the Chafetz Chaim in his discussion of davening in German, to change the siddur into a German siddur because people understand German better. It's a break from the Masorah, and the Gedolim predicted it would lead to tragic consequences, and it did. We would gain a lot from learning from this history. We saw it. We saw it also with the conservatives in the 1900s. And we're seeing it again now in the 21st century, unfortunately, tragically, with what's called open orthodoxy. Okay, we'll stop here.